Good afternoon, Mr. Poplett. No, Mr. McKeever. We closed before lunch by talking about incomplete testing for the thermostatic mixing valves. You recall that? There's what may be a similar issue a few pages further on at 414 in your report. You start, there's section 5.9 on validation, and you consider various items within that. And then on the next page at 597 and 598, you are, as I understand it, talking about water samples and failed results at this point. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you describe at 597 samples that were taken in December 2014. Dates in the document having shown that disinfection had been carried out 24 hours previously on 20, or 1 day previously, 20 December 2014, and a fallow period 48 hours is required between disinfection and water sampling. And then at 598, the reports provided to you show evidence of failed samples. Most of the failed areas were retested and passed on 25 January 2015 and 11 February 2015. However, there are no certificates to verify the 3 failed samples that are referenced as being retested on the 18th of January. No evidence that the system was fully re-sterilised, despite the RAMS stating that to be the process following failed samples. First question, what's RAMS?
Sorry, risk assessment method statement.
The second point is that I ran the 2 paragraphs together, but in fact I think the issues are separate. 597, you're talking about lack of a fallow period or short fallow period.
Yes.
Why is that a problem?
Because the British Standard requires that there is 48 hours between the disinfection process and the sampling or resampling of the water systems.
The problem at 598 is different, which is that where you have, what I think you're saying is, where there's a failed sample, then not only should there be retesting of it, but there should be a re-sterilisation process that takes place. When? In between the two?
Yes, when you get the failed sample, depending upon the level and in line with the Trust's water policy, it specifies resampling and the number of resamples that are required before declaring a system back into full specification.
So in looking back at sample records from the turn of 2014 to 2015, you're able to identify these 2 separate types of irregularities or gaps in the sampling record. How concerned are you by those?
It could be as simple as a typo, in which case I wouldn't be excessively concerned. However, it could be that the testing sample wasn't being followed as specified, which could have significant impact on the results.
At this remove, is there any light that could be shed upon either of those?
I couldn't comment on that.
Next paragraph, the next full paragraph at 510, which is over at page 416. You are going on to consider here the key information necessary prior to occupation. You set out in the first bullet point list a number of assurances on a number of topics on which assurances would be expected to be obtained. Is that correct?
Correct.
But then below that bullet list, you are noting that there were some information that was not available or present at the time of handover.
Correct.
The first bullet is records relating to flushing. Second is full water-related operating maintenance information. Third bullet over the page is the lack of an initial water safety plan, including comprehensive water risk assessment. And the fourth is evidence of water safety group records. Can you explain the significance of each of those being missing, please?
Yes. In terms of the flushing records, I think we've covered in some detail. But again, if you can't evidence that the flushing took place once the system was wetted and remained wet, then that would give me serious areas of concern of potential systemic colonisation. Operating and maintenance information, if you don't get that, ideally before the system goes into use, how can you then run and maintain it in accordance with the requirements that the O&M manual lays down? There are standard PPMs and it is covered in other areas, but certainly for specific areas of plant, there may be specific requirements in those O&Ms and they need to be detailed, understood, assessed, and then appropriate maintenance instructions put in place prior to occupation. An initial water safety plan should have been part of the plan at design stage. So it's not something that you think about when you hand it over, you think about it when you are designing it and build in the necessary paperwork with that respect. And finally, the water safety group terms of reference and assurance of meetings, audits, again, should all be in place prior to the system going live. It shouldn't be that you walk into a finished hospital cold and start from a standing start. You can get a lot of this work and a lot of the processes in place through the design stage, so you hit the ground running, to coin a phrase.
Thank you. In the middle of that page is a description of things that we've covered adequately already, flushing dump valves. The bottom of the page, you mentioned that you're going to go on to discuss 4 principal areas for concern in a water system and therefore where control is appropriate. Am I reading that line correctly? Temperature, flow, usage or turnover and cleanliness. I think we've probably covered those adequately. They're the next 3 paragraphs, and the top of page 419 is the last of those, cleanliness. But then there's another section on provision of backflow protection, 511.8. You mentioned backflow a little bit earlier in the context of the thermostatic valves. Over the page at 420, there is an unnumbered paragraph where you're making reference to findings, specific findings on backflow protection. February 2020, Scottish Water Bylaws inspection was undertaken, which identified a significant number of instances where inadequate backflow protection issues were present, 42 items, including a number of multiples. In March 2023, a return visit was completed and this demonstrated a significant number of areas remained to be addressed, 35. These reports and the level of progress achieved provides evidence of poor progress in rectifying identified areas of non-compliance to statutory obligations of Scottish Water Bylaws. The point you make in the last sentence is specifically about compliance. It shows that where compliance is required, it hasn't been universally adhered to. Now, presumably that's a problem of its own.
Yes.
But this is all in the context of backflow. And although we touched on it earlier in terms of mixing valves, what's the backflow issue being discussed at this section of the report? Is it the same one or something else?
It is the same basic principle that backflow protection is in effect a one-way valve. So it makes sure water can flow in one direction but can't reverse and flow backwards or back against itself.
Why is that important?
There are different classifications of backflow protection. The principal one for the TMVs is that it is designed to prevent the mixing of hot and cold water and limit the blended water temperature to the delivery side of a TMV to the outlet. So we don't get pockets of blended water in either the hot or the cold water pipework. So the primary supply of both hot and cold remains uncontaminated or unblended, and it's only blended at the point of use.
So that would prevent the temperature from feedbacking on itself and being thrown off. Correct.
You can also require backflow protection where you have pressure differentials, within the system, or you have it where the method in which you are using the water requires a backflow protection. The simplest example of that is a toilet cistern. You have the water delivered through a float valve, but there is a clear air gap between the water that sits in the toilet cistern and the incoming water supply. It's to make sure that water that has been stagnant in a toilet cistern cannot backfeed into the mains water feed and then go on to another area of the water distribution system.
So in that paragraph that I read out to you, there isn't any specification of what the 42 or the 35 items were about. Should I understand the concern as being primarily about record keeping then, rather than about the, or rather, excuse me, about the general compliance issue, rather than about any specific incidences of backflow protection which you're aware?
The water supply water quality regulations require the Water Supply Authority to undertake rolling inspections to ensure that non-domestic services are safe and appropriate. That inspection was first undertaken in 28th of February, and a report, which I believe is in evidence, identified the 42 areas of concern that they had in terms of compliance to those regulations. A year later, or just over, 3 years later, they returned and identified that 35 remained to be addressed. So it is breaches of the potential breaches of the water supply, water quality regulations, which are the responsibility of, in this case, Scottish Water Authority, to address in terms of the level of seriousness. I'm merely reporting that evidence is shown that limited progress had been made over a 3-year period, reducing 42 down to 35.
Thank you. 2 pages further on at 422, we've got a section that begins on drainage and wastewater systems. Just to summarise this, at 5.11.24, you are noting that there's a risk from the drainage system, or a potential risk. And then at 5.11.25, you give a view on how drainage should be treated, and you say, for this reason, in my opinion, it's essential to include elements in internal drainage systems under the remit of the Water Safety Group, and as such to include essential elements of its management into the water safety plan and policies of the organisation. Are you aware of whether or not the Water Safety Group now includes internal drainage systems in its agenda?
I don't know.
Are you aware of any policies specifically relating to drainage system?
Again, it is now included as part of the Estates Technical Bulletin issued by NHS England, but I am not aware of any current amendments to policy to specifically cover internal above ground drainage.
Three pages further on, at the top of page 425, you touch on drains briefly as part of a paragraph about routine cleaning. You've just made a note here that the 2007 specification advises that routine cleaning of showers, hand wash basins, sinks, etc. should include a surface clean of the drain and removal of any visible debris hairs by the use of tweezers. We've heard in evidence some conflicting views, or that there exist conflicting views, as to the extent to which drains should be subject to cleaning at all. What are your views about cleaning disturbing drains? How should one approach them?
It's a very difficult topic, because the problem with any disinfection process is that you can clean and disinfect a drain, but the first time that it is then reused, it is recontaminated. By their very nature, they handle waste water with carrying potential contamination within them. So the efficacy of continual cleaning process is currently unproven and very difficult to be prescriptive at what frequency would be effective and indeed what method would be effective. Obviously, disinfecting drains also has an environmental impact in that you are potentially adding huge quantities of disinfectant to a wastewater system, which ultimately goes through to the very closely located sewage works. So excessive disinfection is almost impossible to deliver and of limited evidence-based research to be effective. In critical areas, current thinking is that reducing the location of drainage or water outlets so we minimise any cross-contamination or splash from them in the immediate vicinity of clinical or patients is the preferred option. In some cases, routine sterilisation or cleaning has been undertaken, but it is incredibly difficult that one of the bugs, and I apologise, I only know it as CPE, it has an extremely long Latin word to describe it, basically comes from and lives within fecal matter, urinary, it comes from human beings. If you have a shower in a shower tray, you will wash that down into the drain. It can live and multiply very happily in that drain. The next person who enters into that shower will potentially stand on that drain cover, have their conditioner, body wash, whatever, on the floor of the shower, and then colonise themselves with the infection from the previous occupant. To effectively clean and sterilise a drain in between every usage is impractical and, as I say, carries with it other considerations. So the real final answer to that is further evidence needs to be compiled, and from a microbiological perspective, the efficacy and extent of cleaning needs to be agreed. There isn't currently a fixed method other than that outlined, which I reference within my statement.
Thank you. The lower half of that page is again dealing with types of valves, and you spoke to us about that at the start, but then over the page you come to the conclusion on this section of the report. So summing up on the design, installation, commissioning process. Again, in the first sentence, domestic water systems at the point of handover, patient occupation were in a suboptimal condition. And you set out issues which we've looked at. You speak the first bullet points about filtration. The reference in the second half of that first bullet is something that I don't think we mentioned, but I understand to be very high-grade secondary ultrafiltration that was brought in as part and parcel of the change to bring in chlorine dioxide dosing in 2019. You note in the last sentence, the reason and need for this very high grade of filter has not been provided. Do you have any comment to make on the installation of high-grade secondary ultrafiltration at that point at all? Does it make sense to you?
I haven't seen any evidence of the thought process or decision process and the recording of same in terms of determining that that level of filtration was required.
Does it make sense to you that extra filtration of any grade would be part and parcel of introducing chlorine dioxide?
No.
Second bullet is, I think, a reference back to the list of lists identified by DMA Canyon. You make reference there to pre-occupation risk assessment. Is that correct?
Correct.
Then 3 is about the commissioning process including wet testing, and you've covered that. Lack of validation is 4. 5 is the TMT and TMV, the valves and taps, thermostatic mixing, and there's where the phrase never event appears, I couldn't find earlier in the last 2 lines. Over the page, you identify that overall system was not fully compliant. Issues were known and acknowledged, but the system was accepted into operation. And at that time, NHS GGC did not have all the necessary controls or processes in place to manage or address the potential risks as detailed in the following section. That was section 6. Go back, please. The paragraph below that, just for completeness, is a different issue again. This is a specific substantive issue. Types of components installed within the water systems didn't minimise the number of components or elements within components, and this may have provided additional surface areas or nooks and crannies where microorganisms could colonise and produce biofilm. What do you have in mind there?
It's an observation based upon the fittings used, a number of them would have areas which could promote or at least harbour microbiological activity.
Which fittings?
Flexible connections as one. The types of taps and the internal surfaces of tap outlets. Anything that had unnecessary complexity or rough surfaces all give potential for colonisation or collection of biofilm scale and therefore microorganisms.
We've heard from other witnesses about taps and the internal surfaces of taps. Flexible connectors or flexible connections, what's the issue with those?
Again, they are lined with different types, or can be lined with different types of material, and over time they can crack, which gives, again, a nook or cranny, for want of a better term, where biofilms can lodge and seed.
Does that include flexible hoses, or?
It does.
It does. The last issue you mentioned was presence of rough surfaces or unnecessary complexity. Do you have any particular fittings or pieces of kit in mind?
Primarily taps.
And then the last paragraph on the page there is about backflow protection, which we've dealt with. Now that's the end of your section 5. Section 6 over the page starts maintenance and operation of the water system. So from this point on in the report, as I read it, you're beginning to assess material regarding how the system is operated after handover.
Correct.
Having before then looked at handover, up to handover itself. Section 1 is dealing with the water safety plan and weak policy, and you're tracing out here the evolution of those documents since 2015. Is evolution a normal process in keeping a water safety plan over premises?
Yes. It should be considered as a live document which is continually reviewed and updated.
I'm particularly interested in the last paragraph of that section, 6.1.5. You're noting here, following a review, the current policy and written scheme, they appear satisfactory and comprehensive, although you're noting a potential query relating to frequency of TMV, TMT testing, which detailed below is 6 monthly, which is compliant but referenced as quarterly within the written scheme. Is there a substantive problem there, or are you just simply noticing a discrepancy?
Just a discrepancy.
You'd mentioned at 6.1.4 that the written scheme is the most detailed source of instruction. You make reference there to 2023 version of that scheme in the last line, revision H. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, among the documents that I had for you today is a slightly later version, which had been bundle 27, volume 1 at page 276. Now, you it was revision H in the paragraph which I read. This is revision J, 2024. You won't, I think, have seen this, is that correct?
Correct.
But in terms of comprehensiveness of the document, which is what you were talking about when we first raised it, do we get some idea of that from, if we go on 2 pages, 278, is where the contents pages start. We see various items, general overview, 4 items, recording 5 items, management arrangements, and a host of sections going down to the bottom of the page. And then over the next page, there's maintenance procedures and perhaps 20 entries under that. The one I'm interested in, I've got a specific question about this. Well, firstly, does this indicate, in your eyes, a suitably comprehensive water written scheme for these premises?
Without a detailed review and considering the size of the document, it is impossible to state, but on the basis of the contents page, it looks to be comprehensive.
Yes, my apologies, I should have made that clear on the basis of what you can see here. This covers the sort of thing you'd expect to see. The one I'm interested in is 4.1.8, which is the entry for sampling plan. And if I'm right, that should be at 325 of this document. The lower half here is detailing a significant sampling regime within the QAH campus. The block of text, the 4 lines there, are indicating the types of things the types of organisms that are tested for. And we see some that we've mentioned, Legionella, Pseudomonas, Cupravidis are mentioned there. It's larger now, can you see that?
Yep.
Below that, we've got a bullet list, circumstances under which samples are taken, prior alterations, handovers, part of cleaning, and so forth. And then detailing of control measures in the free text, the last 3 lines below that. Or the fact that there should be control measures and they are a main supply sample. Now, firstly, on the basis of that relatively brief information, does that indicate that the written scheme properly addresses sampling?
Potentially, yes. It says when they should be sampled. It says details what should be sampled for. The critical part of sampling is what to do if the results aren't as they should be and outside of control measures. So that information would be needed to comment appropriately on the adequacy. But on the face of it, yes, it looks comprehensive.
Well, there is at least one other GGC document that addresses sampling. It'll be at Bundle 18, Volume 2. It should be page 459. And we see here the Greater Glasgow and Clyde logo in the top right and the heading Standard Operating Procedure in the document number WQS 017. Procedures in the event of out of specification sample for Legionella and other monitored bacteria. Starts with a list of references, which I don't think there'll be anything surprising in those 9. Will there? Then heading sampling and monitoring, mention of external service providers to carry that out. You see that?
Yep.
And that's specified in point 1 as being DMA, who are designated NHS specialist water service providers to carry out sampling within the QH state of outlets on a rotational basis as follows. And then there's a table. And the table is addressing in the left-hand column particular wards or areas. Second column, particular frequency. Third, there are notes indicating various things, how many samples should be taken and so forth. And fourth is headed analysis. I take that to be which organism analysis it should be subjected to once taken. Am I correct about that?
I don't know, it's not my document, but I would make the same presumption. I've had a very brief review of this, and I am surprised that in Ward 1D of PICU, Legionella doesn't appear to feature, whereas it does appear to feature in every other clinical area listed. And I am unclear on what the analysis of potable relates to. Other than that, it seems extremely comprehensive, and frequencies exceed the minimum standards specified in SHTM.
Just to illustrate comprehensiveness, the next page, the table continues. It continues for a few pages more, but basically the pattern is the same: area, frequency, notes, and analysis. Returning to the report, at 432, we may have covered this already, but the bottom of page 432 is where you make a point that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you referred to this morning, that temperature control regime is the preferred strategy for reducing the risk from Legionella and other waterborne organisms in water systems. This will require monitoring on a regular basis. Just to be clear about that, when you say monitoring on a regular basis, are you referring to monitoring for presence of Legionella, or monitoring for whether that is still the best system to use?
Neither. I'm referring to monitoring of temperatures.
Right. Thank you. And do you have indication that that's happening?
Yes.
.435 is where we move from there into section 7, post-completion works and improvements to address identified issues present from handover. In here, the exercise is in the first instance, to record some works that have been carried out over the period. It suffices, I think, for me to note what these are. Unless you have any comments to make, I'll give you the opportunity. Do you have anything further to say about what's said here about domestic hot water expansion vessels?
No.
7.2 is the March 2019 filtration system. We've covered that, but do you have any comments to make on it?
No.
The redesign of wards 2A and 2B in March 2022 is at 7.3.
Nothing to add.
And over the page at 7.4, there's a change, because here you start discussing verification of operation for water systems since handover. And by verification, am I right in saying that you simply mean the checking to make sure that things are working as they should?
Yes.
7.4.3 records an appointment made. It mentions firstly, NHS GGC had an authorising engineer for water for all properties under control of the board. The AEW recommends the appointment of an APW authorised person for water, is that right?
Correct.
However, there's no record of an APW being appointed in writing for QH and RHC until June 2018. From handover in 2015, management implementation of planned and reactive tasks relating to water systems was undertaken by estates officers and estates managers who had transferred to the new facility from other locations. First point there is that there was an appointment that should have been made and hadn't been. Could you comment on that, please?
No, other than there was no evidence of the appointment until the June 2018 date.
My fault for asking the question. Can you comment on the significance of there being an appointment that ought to have been made and hadn't been?
It boils down to, if the estates officers and estates managers were from previous locations and were well versed in the requirements of the management of water systems, it is probably fair to say that it is a paperwork error and wouldn't have any major impact. However, given the size, complexity and type of water systems designed and installed, the fact that the individuals who ran the system for approximately 3 years had no formal assessment of competency could give rise to serious concerns about the maintenance activities in those times.
But whether or not those were met, those concerns were met, is not a matter that you can presumably
I can't
advise on.
No.
The rest of the section is where you're tracing through, among other things, you're tracing through the history of the period via, among other things, authorising engineers' reports. And you yourself are an authorising engineer for water.
I am.
Now, there were a number of those, and I'll take you, I think, to just one of them. If we look at 7.4.7 on the next page, you're recording, firstly, a written scheme being developed through the early part of 2018. And then on the sixth line, the last beginning recommendation, sentence beginning, the annual AEW, authorising engineer for water audit, was undertaken in July 2018, in which the auditor noted that, quote, there have been significant improvements and advancements in the delivery of the water system risk reduction processes, and since the previous audit was completed in 2017. See that?
Yep.
And thereafter, we've got a recording of authorised person appointments finally being made in June and August of that year. Now, in terms of the authorising engineer audit, if we go to bundle 18, volume 2, we should find it page 909. Is this that audit?
Yes.
And the executive, this audit starts with the date of it, 23rd July 2018, and that page starts with recording the previous survey and begins the general description of the site. That continues over to page 910, and then there's an executive summary recording that in the first two paragraphs, the first paragraph, that there had been a previous audit and since then a microbiological issue in the hospital. But then noting in the last two paragraphs, it's pleasing to note and is worthy of positive comment that there have been significant improvements and advances in the delivery of the water-based risk reduction processes since the previous audit was completed in 2017. While the improvements to be commended, there still remain a number of issues that should be addressed. Many of these are required in the task definition and delivery area. As an example, these include issues such as clearly defining delivering a little-used outlet flushing regime that meets the requirements of the SHTM and HSG standards. Firstly, is that direction of progress broadly what you had noted yourself from regarding the DMA Canyon risk assessments from 2015 to 2017?
Yes.
And if we go on 2 pages, 912, this is where we note the recommendations. And we note that on this page, there's the first 3 of the recommendations, and they're marked yellow. Yellow would indicate the lowest level of risk, is that correct? In fact, you may not be able to answer that question.
It's not my audit format, I couldn't comment.
Yes. But we have a series of recommendations on this and following pages, concluding on 916. So 916 is not the conclusion, that's where it turns red. 922 should be the conclusion. Concludes with number 35. So there's a recommendation about the water safety group here. Now, I shan't take you through the other audits in the same way, but if we move back to your report, what you're doing at 747, then 748 is noting, over the page, 748 is noting that there wasn't an audit in 2019, 749 is noting the audit for 2020, and you give a narrative about that, about many of the tasks being completed, however, with recommendations for record keeping. Then paragraph 10, DC 2021, another audit, and the auditors reporting there was now significant improvements in all aspects of water management. Do you see that?
Yep.
And over the page again, first couple of lines of paragraph 11, in 2022, the now routine audit was undertaken and the auditor reporting a high level of completion of required tasks. And further narrative. And then at 12, in 2023, the audit was undertaken and the auditor reported in regard to water systems at the hospitals that delivery of required risk reduction processes and procedures was virtually complete. Presumably that's a good thing.
It is.
Does that show clear progress from your point of view from throughout that period?
Yes.
In fact, if we look over the page at 440, these are the 9 recommendations from the 2023 audit. The next page, 441, is returning to the question of the water safety group. 7.5.1 is noting that the group should have been in place at the design stage, which failing it should have been at handover. And I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think you referred to that earlier on as being the expected standard for a water safety group. Is that right?
Correct.
But then you noted 7.5.2, it was understood the WSG was effectively founded in 2017. But again, at the close of that paragraph, you're noting that since then, management of the systems and progress to address them has significantly improved. 7.6 is moving on to a different question, staffing questions. First sentence here, for the evidence provided and findings from the AEW audit reports, it would appear that the site was handed over and became operational without an appropriate planned preventative maintenance programme in place. And then you're going on and saying here and over the page that while there's progress, you still have concerns about resourcing and extent of staff training. Can you comment on that? What are your concerns here?
It's more highlighting the need that, as a water AE, my attitude is one that you can never have enough people to do the job. It's also to do with individuals holding multiple AP roles and not being accorded sufficient time or resources to fully or adequately complete all of their duties.
Over the page, at 7.7, you make a specific recommendation, which is that there ought to be a quarterly report from the authorised person to the water safety group. Why quarterly?
Two reasons, really. If you rely purely on the annual AE audit, then you could have had a problem for 11 and a half months without addressing it. A quarterly status report provides ongoing evidence of continual improvement, and it also satisfies the requirements of initiatives such as the premises assurance model within NHS risk management. So it's, in my opinion, a good format to keep things fresh and high on the agenda and provide written evidence that management processes are in place and continue to function appropriately unless reported by exception. I
think you said at the start of our discussions this morning that the default assumption you were making about the meeting period for a water safety group was quarterly,
Correct.
and it would tie in with that.
Exactly.
So we look at the next page, we'll see that this closes off your consideration of operation management since occupation, and then at the page after 445 you get to conclusions related to maintenance and operation of the water system. The first three paragraphs on that page are your summary of the past of the system, and you're noting there are defects at handover, is that right?
Correct.
Before it's 7.9, you're moving on to the separate question of the current condition and potential issues and risk.
Yes.
791 is noting that there are still a number of issues in the latest authorising engineer audit. I think there were the 9 that you'd reproduced, but you're downplaying, is that the right way to put it? You're stressing that these issues are not uncommon. You have any comment to make about that?
No, other than as the water safety plan is a live document, the water systems can be seen as a live and ever-changing clinical environment. So it's something that needs constant review and adjustment as the usage of a hospital evolves and develops over time.
You say there that generally the level appears to be satisfactory.
Yes.
792, you are saying the water safety group's in place and operating effectively, and I think we discussed that this morning, is that right? Anything
Correct.
to add to that?
Nope.
793, noting current water safety plan policy is considered appropriate and suitable for the management of water systems at Queen Elizabeth. However, given the issues identified in the design construction handover process, it's considered appropriate to recommend a review of the water system provision as outlined below. And you go on to give details of what that review might consist of in the following paragraphs. Are there any particular comment that you wish to make about your suggestions there?
No.
So that leaves me only the final question, which is, we've dealt with the past. The second question dealt with the present. The question is the system no longer in an unsafe condition? Or is the system, what's the condition of the system now? Is it in an unsafe or safe condition now?
As I've said previously, I think it is incredibly difficult to give a binary answer as to whether a system is safe or unsafe. What I can say is that the current maintenance practices on the evidence that I've reviewed appear satisfactory, and the system's subject to some underlying design issues are being appropriately managed and maintained.
You mentioned two things in the last sentence there: underlying issues and appropriate maintenance, operation and maintenance of them. Does it make sense to think about matters in these terms, that one can have a system that may have flawed parts within it, but that so long as one works out a way to neutralise, mitigate, bring down the level of those flawed parts, then one can bring it into acceptable realms?
Yes, with the proviso that you've also got to factor into that the other variables, such as clinical risk profiles, how various areas of the hospital are used, and other interactions with water systems. So the short answer, yes. The long answer is it needs to be kept under continuous review to ensure that the condition remains satisfactory.
so far as you can tell, the current means of operation and maintenance of the system are doing so.
Yes.
No further questions at this point for this witness, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. McKeever. Mr. Poplett, as you'll recollect from yesterday, I need to check that there are no further questions. So if I can ask you to return to the witness room, and, we should be able to reconvene in about 10 minutes.
Mr McKeever, there will be some questions, my lord.
We have some additional questions, Mr. Poplett. Oh, Mr. McKeever.
Thank you. The first question is one where I'm in slightly unusual position of picking up an issue that was raised in yesterday's evidence. So we're in ventilation territory. If you recall this, as part of your evidence, you were asked about newly installed ventilation into Ward 2A. And it was put to you that, or suggested to you that there was now a separate supply and extract system had been installed in that ward. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you said that you were asked to agree whether there was, as a result, there was no risk of any cross-contamination. And you agreed with that. Do you recall?
Yes.
If there were another ward where there was not a separate supply and extract ventilation system, would it follow from that there, or would it mean that there was a risk of cross-contamination in that ward?
Not necessarily. It would be determined by pressure differentials between the two adjacent spaces for cross-contamination to exist, but also if systems were isolated, supply was isolated and extract wasn't, or extract was isolated and supply was, then there is possible that if it serves multiple areas, there can be a risk of cross-contamination via that route. But it is ostensibly the supply continues to blow and the extract continues to suck. So it is a small theoretical risk. The greater risk is from a differentiation of pressure differentials between adjacent areas.
Okay, thank you. That, I think, is enough on that question. The last two questions are about water system. The first topic is about something that we did cover, which was within the report at page 428. There was a section addressing thermostatic mixing valves. So at the bottom of the page, 621 goes on to that, and the top of the next page makes clear that you're also considering the need to replace TMVs and the TAP version, thermostatic mixing taps, and information that not having been recorded. Can I ask at this section, or firstly, are you aware of the Horn Optitherm taps?
Aware and not incredibly familiar with them, but yes, aware of them.
Are you aware of, but do they fall within the category of TMTs?
Yes, they do.
And are you aware that such taps were present at the Queen Elizabeth?
I wasn't, but it wouldn't cause me undue concern.
Insofar as you do have knowledge of the taps, are you aware of whether they have specific cleaning instructions separate from the pressure testing requirements that you're describing at the passage that we've just looked at?
That would have to be something that I did a detailed review on the O&M instructions for the particular model of tap being deployed. The general test methodology as laid out in the SHTM would not change.
When you're talking about testing at this passage of the evidence, are you talking about pressure testing or about cleaning or about both?
Pressure testing is a term that was included for a brief period of months in the HTM. I would not be able to be absolute that it was included in the SHTM, where pressure testing was included as part of the 6-monthly testing of the TMVs. Unfortunately, it was identified after publication that the provision of in-service pressure testing would require the installation of pressure test points which themselves could offer an area where microorganisms could settle and proliferate. So the requirement for routine pressure testing was removed from the 6-monthly requirement, and it relates now to temperature, water temperatures, individual both hot and cold, blended temperatures, the fail-safe connection, and a requirement to clean and clear any debris from the strainer baskets.
Just to focus on the cleaning question, did you see any evidence during your compilation of the report that that cleaning process had been carried out with respect to either those taps or taps like those?
From recollection, and I am working from recollection, there was a specific question on the TMV testing sheet that related to the cleaning of the strainer baskets, and that indicated that it was undertaken.
We did hear some evidence about specific cleaning facility having been built at some point to carry out this work. Do you have any awareness of this?
No.
And finally, if there had been, that was, the evidence was that that was done in around 2018. If that, as a result of that, there was a period from 2015 to 2018 in which the cleaning wasn't carried out, would that be a matter of concern for you?
Yes.
Any particular reason for that?
There are multiple complex components and parts within a thermostatic mixing valve or tap mixing valve that would give rise to potential colonisation. The 6-monthly clean is one method used to make sure that they remained clear, clean and functional. So if that wasn't undertaken for 3 years, that would be a concern and a potential source of elevated microbial action.
Thank you. The last question which I have relates to a topic that you referred to very briefly in passing, question of corroded valves and or pipework. Did you see any evidence of corrosion having occurred at Queen Elizabeth?
Not from the evidence that I've reviewed.
Thank you. That concludes my questions, Lord.
Mr. Poplett, fear that your evidence is now finished. So once again, thank you very much for your attendance today and yesterday and answering questions. And thank you for the preparation of your reports. But you're now free to go. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, that's, I think, concludes for today, Mr. McKeever. We reconvene on Tuesday, perhaps with Mr. McIntosh.
Correct, my Lord, with
Chair.
Drs. Dempster and Mumford, I understand.
All right. Well, can I wish everyone a good weekend, and we'll see each other, all being well, on Tuesday.